There is a specific kind of tired that has nothing to do with how much you slept. It is the kind that comes from giving and giving, with very little ever coming back. You know their patterns. You know how the story usually ends. And somehow, when they call, you are already on your way. This is not about being naive. You see exactly what is happening. Stopping just feels like something you are not sure you are allowed to do. For most people living inside this pattern, it did not begin with a choice. It began somewhere early, in a place small enough to be a childhood bedroom. Maybe the love around you was real, but it was also inconsistent. And when love is inconsistent, a child learns to become the variable that makes it stay. So they became very good at reading rooms, anticipating needs, and smoothing things over before they became problems. Over time, that stopped feeling like survival and started feeling like identity. Being the helper, the fixer, the one who always comes through. It stops being something they do and becomes something they are. And you cannot simply stop doing something you believe you are. And this is where it gets complicated, because the people who never give back are not always cruel. They may genuinely care in the limited way they are capable of caring. That partial truth, the warmth that is sometimes there, is exactly what makes the pattern so difficult to leave. You are not holding on because you are not paying attention. You are holding on because some of it is real. There is also something else happening, something quieter and harder to admit. Helping feels safe. Needing feels dangerous. And that is not an accident. When you grow up in an environment where your needs were dismissed, minimized, or simply ignored, you learn very quickly that needing things creates distance, and giving things brings people closer. So the nervous system made a deal. Stay on the giving side of every relationship, and you will never have to feel the specific pain of asking and being left empty-handed. The problem is that a deal made by a child to survive an environment does not automatically expire when the environment changes. You carry it into every room you enter as an adult, into friendships where you are always the one who checks in first, into relationships where you apologize more than you should, into situations where your comfort is quietly always the last thing on the list. And the most disorienting part is that it often feels normal because it has always been normal for you in every relationship you can remember. There is a specific type of relationship that tends to find people like this, not because those people are weak, but because they are readable. They signal availability, warmth, and an almost endless capacity to absorb. These are not necessarily bad people, but they are people who have learned, consciously or not, that someone else's giving can substitute for the work of showing up themselves. They call when things are hard. They disappear when things are fine. And they return, reliably, the moment the tide turns back in their direction. And every time they return, something in you lifts, because part of you has been waiting, and part of you is relieved that the waiting is over, at least for now. That lift, that relief, is important to understand, because it is not just affection. It is also a nervous system that was trained to find safety in being chosen, even briefly, even incompletely. This is one of the reasons it is so hard to simply decide to stop, because the pattern does not just live in your thoughts, it lives in your body, in the way your chest responds before your mind has even finished processing. Knowing the pattern intellectually and feeling free from it are two very different things, and most people discover this the hard way, the moment they actually try to change something. Because the first time you do not show up for someone who expects you to, the guilt arrives so fast and so completely that it feels indistinguishable from having done something wrong. That guilt is not evidence that you did something wrong. It is evidence of how deep the wiring goes and how much your system has come to associate boundaries with betrayal. None of this means you are broken. It means you built a very logical system inside a situation that required one. The system just needs updating, not replacing. The first thing worth understanding is the difference between generosity and compulsion. Generosity feels open. It comes from having something and choosing to share it. Compulsion feels like you had no real choice at all. When you give from compulsion, there is always a quiet part of you keeping score. Not because you are calculating, but because some part of you is still hoping the scale will eventually balance on its own. And when it does not balance, when the help is taken and no acknowledgement comes, that quiet score becomes resentment. Not explosive, not dramatic, just a slow and steady accumulation. The resentment is then followed by guilt, because people who have built their identity around giving often feel that resenting someone they love is a moral failure, rather than a natural response to an unfair situation. So they give more to compensate for the resentment they feel guilty about, and the cycle quietly tightens around them, one generous gesture at a time. There is also something that does not get talked about enough: the way that helping someone can feel like control, in the gentlest possible sense of that word. When you help someone, you know what is expected of you, you know how to behave, you know what role you are playing. That clarity is deeply comforting when other parts of life feel uncertain or out of reach. The moment someone no longer needs you, the moment they are fine, sorted, moving forward without requiring anything from you, can trigger a strange and uncomfortable feeling that is hard to name. That discomfort, the one that arrives when you are no longer needed, is one of the most useful pieces of information your inner life can give you. It is telling you something about where your sense of worth has been living. If your value feels most real when you are being useful, when someone needs you, thanks you, depends on you, then rest, reciprocity, and simply being are going to feel strangely threatening. This is not a character flaw. It is a perfectly logical outcome of growing up in an environment where stillness was not safe, where being unneeded meant being invisible, and where love arrived in the shape of tasks completed rather than presence offered. So, what does change actually look like? Not in theory, not as a concept, but in the real and specific texture of a Tuesday afternoon when someone asks you for something and you feel that familiar pull. It starts with a pause, not a wall, not a refusal, not a dramatic declaration of change. Just a moment of space between the ask and the answer. Enough room to ask yourself one honest question. The question is not, do I want to help? The question is, am I helping because I genuinely want to? Or am I helping because the alternative feels too uncomfortable to sit with? Learning to tell the difference between those two things, genuine desire and conditioned reflex, is not a one-time revelation. It is a practice, and it is uncomfortable at first, in the way that any new muscle always is. One of the most disorienting early discoveries is that saying no, or saying not right now, or saying I need to think about it, does not actually destroy the relationship, even when every part of you was certain it would. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes the relationship actually deepens when you stop performing availability and start showing up as someone with genuine limits. But it is also true, and this part matters, that some relationships do not survive the change, because some relationships were built entirely on the premise of your unlimited availability. And when that changes, they have nothing else to stand on. That loss is real, and it deserves to be grieved. It is not a sign that you did something wrong. It is a sign that you finally did something honest. There is a version of this pattern that goes even deeper, where giving has become so automatic that the person has almost no awareness of their own needs anymore. They have spent so long looking outward that the inward direction has gone quiet. If you ask them what they need, they will often answer with what someone else needs. If you ask what they want, they will frequently redirect to what would make another person happy. The self has been outsourced so gradually, they barely noticed it leaving. Reconnecting with your own needs after a long absence is not as simple as making a list. It requires sitting in discomfort long enough for the quieter parts of yourself to feel safe enough to speak again. This is also where the concept of reciprocity becomes worth examining honestly. Not as a transaction, not as a ledger, but as a basic indicator of whether a relationship has enough mutual care to be genuinely sustaining. Reciprocity does not mean every act of care is immediately returned in equal measure. It means that over time, both people in a relationship are genuinely invested in the other's well being, not just when it is convenient. The relationships worth keeping are the ones that can hold your needs without shrinking, that can receive your limits without punishing you, and that show up for you imperfectly, humanly, genuinely when it is your turn to need something. You are allowed to audit your relationships with this in mind, not to punish anyone, not to keep score, but simply to ask yourself honestly which ones leave you fuller than before and which ones consistently leave you emptier. This does not require a confrontation, a conversation, or a dramatic ending. It can begin simply with where you direct your energy, quietly, privately, in the small daily choices about who you call first and who you call back later. And as you redirect that energy, as you give more of it to people who receive it with gratitude and return it with care, something interesting begins to happen. Giving starts to feel different, lighter, more like a choice and less like a debt being paid. The version of you that gives from a full place, from genuine care, from actual desire, from a self that has been tended to, is a far more sustainable and far more joyful version than the one running on obligation and fear of abandonment. There is something that rarely gets said in conversations like this one, and it is that the people who give the most are often some of the most quietly courageous people in any room. The capacity to care deeply, to show up consistently, to hold space for others, that is not weakness. It never was. The problem was never the caring. The problem was the belief, installed early and reinforced often, that the caring had to be unconditional and unlimited in order to count, in order to be enough, in order to make you worth keeping. You were always worth keeping, not because of what you did for people, not because of how available you made yourself, just because you were there, and that was always supposed to be enough. The shift does not happen all at once. There will be moments where the old pull returns, where someone reaches out and the familiar urgency rises before you have even finished reading the message. And in that moment, the moment between the pull and the response, there is now a small space that did not used to exist. That space is not nothing. That space is everything. Progress here does not look like becoming someone who stops caring. It looks like becoming someone whose caring is chosen, deliberate, self-aware, and offered from a place that has been looked after. It also looks like learning to receive, which for many people in this pattern is considerably harder than it sounds. Receiving requires vulnerability. It requires trusting that being on the needing side of an exchange will not cost you the relationship. The first few times you let someone help you, really help you, without immediately finding a way to pay it back or minimize the need, it will feel strange. Let it feel strange. That strangeness is just unfamiliarity, not danger. Somewhere along the way, you may also notice that the people who truly belong in your life, who have always been there in a real way, were never asking you to give endlessly in the first place. They were just there, quietly, consistently, without a ledger. And you may have been so focused on the people who needed more from you that you almost missed how much was already being offered freely. If there is one thing worth carrying away from everything said here, it is this. Your care is not a commodity. It is not a currency. It is not the price of admission to being loved. Your care is something you have, something real and generous and yours. And like anything real and generous and yours,
It deserves to be given to people and places and moments that receive it with the respect it was always worth. You have been generous for a long time. That generosity was never the problem. The only thing that needed to change was the belief that it was all you were allowed to be.
If something in this video felt familiar, if you recognized yourself somewhere in these words, know that you are not alone in this, and that recognition itself is already the beginning of something. If this reached you, consider sharing it with someone who might need it too. Sometimes the most generous thing we can do is pass something useful along to someone. Leaving a comment about what stayed with you, even just one word, helps this kind of content reach the people who need it most. It takes a second, and it genuinely matters. And if you want more of this, more honest conversations about the patterns that shape us, subscribing means you will be there for the next one. We will see you soon.